Hi, I'm Dr. Joe Hall-Patton, or Cypher on this channel, and I've got to talk about the TV show American Primeval. It's basically like someone tried to combine the brutal violence of Blood Meridian with Utah history as a miniseries comprising 6 episodes. There's plenty of drama and bloodshed in Utah history to draw from, so much so that I'm writing a chapter about that for my book on American violence in the Southwest during the frontier period. But it isn't well represented by this show. If you want the actual history that this show purports to cover, I have begun a series on Mormon history that you should check out. I found the whole show bewildering. The main message is this.
So few left in these lands know of grace. There's only brutality here.
I just cannot explain what this show is saying when it so strangely distorts reality. There's times where it's not vicious enough, and other times where there's too much killing. It's this melange of events and fiction that I don't know how to judge, so I simply am ambivalent. I suppose that's what makes this interesting. Blood Meridian itself is a strange melange of truth and fiction about Borderlands violence, but I enjoyed that book. Despite its reputation for brutality, murders and fights are typically less bloody than their real-life counterparts. American Primeval is a bit more complicated, so I just want to go through the plot of the show and compare it to what it's depicting. The show follows a woman who's traveling through Utah in what it claims is 1857 and all the various storylines she transacts. They lay the mythology on thick right from the start with this load of trite hokum. If you want to learn more of just how warped this Wild West crap is, check out my episode on that. We quickly get to Fort Bridger with Jim Bridger still there. He hadn't been there for 2 years by that point and would only return with the US Army behind him. He's a pivotal figure in this plot, but he simply wouldn't have been there. Then there's a random murder and Bridger orders an execution on the spot.
String up the Frenchman.
Even that far on the frontier, justice had procedures to follow, so this is essentially a lynching they casually show like it's normal. It was not. Somehow there are troops already at the fort, even though they didn't arrive until November. Turns out our protagonist had killed her husband back east, and now there's an incredibly high bounty on her. Some ruffians at the fort murder the hunter to take over his bounty. That's not how bounties work, but that's a pretty typical Western trope that's almost always inaccurate. For an example of getting this correct, look at Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid.
Feel I'm knocking up on heaven's door.
That movie's great, and I talked about it in my Death of the Western episode. The first episode climaxes with the Mountain Meadows Massacre, which is just wrong in so many ways. First, this is supposed to be close to Fort Bridger, when the Meadows is on the other end of the territory, just north of today's St. George. Next, they say that the Fancher Party needs a permit because Brigham Young had declared martial law.
Governor Young's declared martial law.
So you tell your governor, no thank you, on his permit.
Young did that 2 days after the massacre concluded, and he didn't know that it had happened yet. Then the attack happens all at once. The real one was far worse. First, there was a brief siege with the wagons getting circled. After a few days, Mormons coaxed the survivors out under a flag of truce, confiscated their weapons, marched them out in separate groups, and massacred every man, woman, and child over the age of 6, a total of roughly 120 fatalities, with the few escapees getting run down across the desert, leaving only 17 that they abducted for 2 years. So the brutality on display throughout this miniseries pales in comparison to what actually happened. In the next episode, the scout who's going to guide our protagonist along with a stowaway Shoshone get in 2 separate fights with Paiutes and bounty hunters and end up together. Brigham Young learns of the massacre and says,
"Do our hands show a drop of blood on this?"
No, sir.
Good. You need to go to Fort Bridger immediately. so that no wild rumors make their way east.
That's dumb and implies he approved of the atrocity. In reality, he had expressly demanded, "You must not interfere with them." He did ominously add, "The Indians, we expect, will do as they please, but you should try and preserve good feelings with them." He would not know the extent of the massacre until 9 days afterward, when chief perpetrator John D. Lee told him in person in Salt Lake City. Young was complicit in a lot of atrocious things, having stoked the anger that caused all of this, but he was merely an accessory after the fact. Wild Bill Hickman is depicted as head of the Nauvoo Legion.
Right, and as you are the leader of the Nauvoo Legion, which is Brother Young's private army in all its bloody glory.
Daniel H. Wells was the general in charge, not Hickman. He was merely a Mormon hitman. Also, why do legionaries have gray uniforms like their Confederates? They wore blue like most militias at the time. One of the families at the massacre in this depiction were LDS members named Pratt. That was quite a prominent name in LDS with 2 apostles in 1856. An Arkansan killed Parley Pratt mere months before Mountain Meadows, because Parley took his wife as a plural one. Arkansas authorities viewed it as a justified killing. Many have speculated that Cedar City and Parowan had heard of this and therefore wanted to massacre the Fancher Party, which was composed of mostly Arkansans bound for California, as though it was some form of revenge for Parley Pratt. But the timing isn't enough for that to have been a significant factor. So this inclusion is just strange. The show disparages Paiutes as crooked lackeys to LDS who simply toss them aside to tie up loose ends.
Sura de Napa, Odihari, Ohotun, Omigat, Wazigat, Gunta, Nahara.
Help me. Now I help you too.
This is a terrible depiction, and honestly, Southern Paiutes could sue the production for slander.
That's slander.
It is not. I resent that. Slander is spoken. In print, it's libel.
They are their own people, who likely left after a couple of days besieging the Fancher train at Mountain Meadows. Nauvoo legionaries were probably the sole perpetrators of the massacre's final part. The series claims that Shoshones were the tribe in direct conflict with Paiutes in Utah and become the most sympathetic group, despite starting with a Shoshone man raping a slave girl whose tongue he's removed. But she kills him and then follows our protagonist, so it's just one bad apple, I guess. Paiutes, Goshutes, Utes, and Shoshones all were in different regions and shouldn't be confused as occupying the same territory. The one genuinely interesting part of this miniseries is how Shoshones debate going to war. It gets surprisingly deep at times, talking about the inevitable backlash that will destroy the tribe.
Do you pray that after the white soldiers have killed you, they will not come here to kill your son?
This country decided these lands don't belong to them. These tribes just stand in the way.
They deserve better than that.
Yes, they do.
That's good stuff. Too bad it begins with this insufferable everyone's evil characterization, but I'll get into what all that develops into toward the end. Lastly, there's Utes, the most powerful tribe in the region, yet the show calls them...
They're just scavengers.
They had kept Spaniards and Mexicans at bay for centuries and made Mormons kowtow to their wishes. What a strange defamation. Army regulars arrive at the Mountain Meadows fairly quickly after it happens and figure out that Mormons did it.
I'm not aware of any tribe that shoes their horses. What kind of Indians wear this?
That's clearly referencing Carleton's investigation during the spring of 1859, a year and a half after the fact, not a week. They show the scout killing some hunters on behalf of the protagonist. Maybe this is a reference to the murder of the Icon Party, but that was a further Mormon atrocity during the Utah War, where Hickman and Porter Rockwell captured some merchants and then killed them. After that, when discussing the massacre with regulars, this exchange happens.
Women and children were murdered.
It happens a lot in these parts.
No, save for plenty of instances during Indian Wars, which this is not referring to, that had not happened before. And that's just the finale of episode 2. With the next one, we have this whole plotline where the protagonist's party gets captured by rapist bandits, and she has to dispatch them herself. This is just wanton cruelty for its own sake, and isn't connected to any history. We also begin a long plotline where Young negotiates Bridger out of his fort.
I want your fort.
And if the army gets their hands on it, it's the end of you Mormons.
Supposedly because he wants to prevent the army from occupying it once they arrive. The army would indeed do that in the winter of 1857 through 58. But in this depiction, they already have regulars running about, even accusing legionaries of the Mountain Meadows.
Well, we heard the whites were involved in the attack. Y'all are real white.
What is even happening here? The only soldiers that arrived ahead of the army was a small contingent under Captain Van Vliet, and that contingent he left in Echo Canyon so that he could go inform Young of the incoming regulars' intentions, all by himself. Furthermore, this is referencing stuff from years before. When Young dismounts in the mud, he whispers,
This is the place.
That's referencing his famous phrase upon entering the Salt Lake Valley.
This is the place.
Why even show that? What are they trying to say? This is baffling. At the end of the episode, Pratt realizes that some legionaries participated in the massacre, and in the following episode, he kills one of them in cold blood. Then he gets abandoned to hook back up with legionaries.
I can't risk waking to you beating my skull in with a rock, claiming I stole your granny's girdle.
The protagonist spends the rest of this and the next episode dealing with her son's broken leg. So we instead spend most of the 5th episode focused on regulars, Shoshones, legionaries, and trappers. Young keeps meeting Bridger like they just traveled the 120-mile trip on a regular basis. It's so weird. Also, in the previous episode, Bridger grievously wounded Hickman. Young acts all disappointed about that, but does nothing. Of course, nothing of the sort happened, and Hickman did in fact attack Bridger's trappers a couple of times in 1853. But once again, that makes no sense for 1857. Instead, we see legionaries massacring regulars. What? Nothing of the sort happened. Maybe this is supposed to reference the Gunnison Massacre during the Walker War of 1853? Mormons did not perpetrate that. We watch Young sermonizing with actual quotes while Hickman kills a traitorous regular to silence the conspiracy.
What we stand for.
We're all gonna burn in hell.
The Lord will help those that help themselves to do right.
No, but maybe this is referencing Hickman killing trapper Richard Yates for supposedly spying. Also, Young should be speaking in a large building in Salt Lake City, but this show never depicts any town save for a distant and blurry image at the end of the show, which is a fake location. I guess the filmmakers lack imagination enough to show Salt Lake City, choosing to make everything in the wild outdoors as though civilization could never possess such brutality. This episode culminates in the bounty hunters taking the protagonists while receiving great casualties from the scout protecting everyone else. Nothing happened like that, but whatever, this is the fun part. The final episode pays off the 3 plot lines. Young buys Bridger out and burns down the fort. Bridger was actually literate, and Young falsified the deed.
I may not be able to read, but I sure can count.
Hence their conflict in 1857. So this doesn't make sense. Furthermore, the show dismisses as a possibility the very real thing Mormons did.
There's some nice open ground just beyond that to make for a profitable post.
Good day.
They created Fort Supply just as Bridger suggested, which would become a brief town to deal with the disastrous handcart trains in late 1856. Mormons did burn what they could of Fort Bridger and Supply City in the summer of 1857, but the trappers had been gone for 3 years at that point. Also, what the heck are these drunk trappers doing singing as the buildings burn down around them? If that's supposed to be symbolic of the end of the fur trapping era, it just fails. But that's not even the strangest conflation at the end of this miniseries. They show the legionaries attacking a Shoshone camp, which turns into a reverse ambush. This fulfills all the talk about revenge backfiring, but it's very strange in this situation. I think they are trying to depict the Bear River Massacre of early 1863, as though it happened 6 years prior. Firstly, the majority of perpetrators were Army volunteers, members of the California Column during the Civil War. The only Mormons there were scouts like Porter Rockwell and sutlers accompanying the troops. The trouble with Shoshone raids only began after the Utah War, so this is simply out of place and oddly blames the victims, who died in larger numbers than at Mountain Meadows. What the f*** is this bullshit? It's supposed to be a culminating moment where Pratt accidentally kills his wife because she's gone native. This is disrespectful and crass. Shoshones still have generational trauma because of Bear River, and the show turned it into a Romeo and Juliet moment, with Mormons alone to blame, because the army is now all dead. I gotta move on before I get any more angry. This loses all meaning and becomes hateful if you know what it's referencing. You can learn more about the Indian Wars during this period with my episode on Greater Reconstruction. The protagonist and Scout fight the bounty hunters and win, but the Scout loses his life in the final fight. They burn his body and then choose to continue on to California rather than settling in some Utah town we only see at a distance. I think they're trying to denounce Utah as a whole at the time, hence the whole
"there's only brutality here."
This is sensitive history. If they just want to blanket denounce everyone involved, from fur trappers, Mormons, and tribe members, then distorting the history this grotesquely undermines the filmmaker's attempted message. This whole miniseries is so discombobulated that it makes no sense to me. I guess you can watch it as an excuse to display a bunch of brutal violence, but that's about all it's good for. This is why no one can film Blood Meridian. It requires an attention to detail that Hollywood lacks. Theoretically, I am precisely the target audience for American Primeval, since I study American violence in the Southwest, which includes Utah. Sadly, the filmmakers became just as lost in the wilderness as their characters. If you want a better depiction of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, watch Under the Banner of Heaven. It somehow does this history better with only a few minutes, though it makes a lot of key mistakes elsewhere. There's also September Dawn, but it makes this stupid love story between an apostate and immigrant that ruins the film. American Primeval is nihilistic nonsense, taking bits and pieces of history out of its original context for the sake of spreading a sanguinary survival story spanning supernumerary spaces. It's simply stupid slop. Try saying that 5 times fast. If that's what you want, fine. If you want something meaningful and fun, you won't find it here. Consult historians next time and the show might actually become something worthwhile. Otherwise, it's a waste of effort.